So we're just going to go ahead and kick this thing off with the next presentation. My name's Scott Spratt. This is Joe Rosales. We're the R&D team with Baseball Info Solutions. And today, the central question of our research is who is responsible for a called strike? So catcher framing has become a pretty hot topic in recent seasons, and I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that entails. Typically, you'll see a pitch that's just off the outside corner of the plate, and you'll see a catcher catch it, but then make the subtle movement of his glove back over the plate, essentially tricking the umpire into making that a pitch appear like a natural strike. And we have an example here with Giovanni Gallardo. See if I can get the video to play. So upper left-hand corner here, you're seeing this exactly play out. Gallardo throws the pitch just off the plate. Lucroy makes that really subtle movement, gets that strike call. Yasiel Puig is upset. But really, extra strikes and extra balls aren't always so clearly the verdict of the catcher's movement. I'll show you a pitch here where Franklin Morales throws this pitch to Anthony Rizzo, and it actually goes right down the middle of the plate. But you'll see that the umpire doesn't call that a strike, partially because the location of the pitch was supposed to be on the outside corner. You saw the catcher had to jump back across the middle of the plate, and it tricked the umpire there. Another example here from the Phillies, Justin DeFreitas. He throws a pitch that actually cuts back over the plate as well, but it starts in on the body of the batter, and the batter kind of flinches and jumps back, and is like, oh, this is going to hit me. The umpire's like, well, that couldn't have been a strike. That was almost going to hit the batter. We have a final example here with Zach Greinke throwing a pitch that actually goes over the edge of the outside batter's box. Nothing else extraordinary about the pitch, but he gets a call to strike anyway. So what I'm really getting at here is the catcher isn't the only man responsible for extra strike or extra ball calls. In fact, all four parties that participate in a pitch, the pitcher, catcher, batter, and umpire, have some impact on whether that pitch is going to be called a strike or a ball. Most publicly available methodologies, and the ones that we used as inspiration here, they only target the catcher and his responsibility, or if they're looking at those other parties, they're looking at it as a means to adjust the credit for the catcher. We really wanted to take this with a fresh approach of finding a method that let us evaluate all four parties and create numbers to measure them all. The result of that research is what we call strike zone plus minus, which becomes strike zone run saved. And it's a way to quantify all of those four parties' credit. That's one of the unique aspects of our method here, as well as some of the inputs that we used, including Baseball Info Solutions command data, which I'll get into more when I explain the variables that we use. So before we even begin to split who is responsible for getting any of that credit, what we have to realize is that there are properties of every pitch that determine its likelihood for being a strike before anyone else has any influence. The obvious one is pitch location, but also the ball and strike count, the pitch command, and the batter handedness have a big impact on whether or not a pitch is called a strike. And so those are the four that we really zoned in on to apply in our model. We considered many more, such as pitcher handedness, pitch type, and home and road split. But once we've accounted for the original four that we did, we saw very strong results, which we'll get into later, and found that the other variables had lesser impact as we incorporated those original ones. So we stuck with those four. Let's walk through them one by one. Pitch location, again, it's the most obvious one. If a pitch is thrown down the middle of the plate and it wasn't that pitch that Franklin Morales just threw, it's going to be called a strike. Meanwhile, if you throw a pitch that's well off the outside of the plate or high or low, that's going to be called a ball almost 100% of the time. But notice the bands around the edge of the strike zone. That's the gray area, or really the yellow region of our diagram here. In those situations, a pitch that is a natural strike, that is within the actual boundaries of the strike zone, only gets called a strike sometimes. And if it's just off the edge of the plate, it's only getting called a ball sometimes. So there are these other factors that come into play here, in addition to the location. The ball and strike count, for anyone that's played baseball growing up, they probably are familiar with this. In the prototypical example that I would use is the 3-0 count. If a pitcher throws a ball anywhere near the plate on a 3-0 count, the umpire is going to probably give them a strike. And that tendency actually extends to all pitcher-friendly counts and all hitter-friendly counts. When the pitcher has the advantage, the umpire is more likely to benefit the hitter by calling extra balls. And if the hitter has the advantage, then the umpire is more likely to benefit the hitter benefit the pitcher by calling extra strikes. A pitch command, I mentioned a second ago that this is unique data that we collected Baseball Info Solutions. We actually do this by charting the location of the catcher's mitt prior to every pitch, and then when we chart the location of the actual pitch itself, we have that comparison between the two to know how close was the pitcher to actually hitting his target. The diagram demonstrates how we incorporated this actually into our model here. The red bands represent pitches where the location of the pitch came very close to the location of the catcher's target, so he's really hitting his spots. This is the not Franklin Morales pitch example. As you get farther and farther away, it is less likely that the umpire is going to give a strike, or maybe more likely that he'll give a ball on a pitch that actually was a strike. And our final variable here is batter handedness, and this works both for left and right-handed batters in the same way. It flips with the mirror to mirror the batter's stance. And that is, if the ball is over the inside part of the plate from the hitter's perspective, then the umpire is less likely to call a strike. And if it's away from the batter, he's more likely to call a strike. All right, I'm going to pass this over to Joe to explain exactly how this all works behind the scenes.
All right, so I'm going to get into some of the dirty details of our calculation a little bit. If you're familiar at all with the way that some strength of scheduling kind of metrics are calculated, we took a sort of a similar approach to that, where our methodology was sort of an iterative one, where for the first iteration we look at every single pitch, and prior to having any knowledge of the tendencies of any individual players involved, we're just going to divide the credit for whether that pitch was called a ball or strike between all four parties. Once we do that for every single pitch, and then we add up all those pluses and minuses for every single player that was involved, we'll find that some players have a net positive impact, some players have a net negative impact, and we can sort of now start to use those as an indication of what their tendencies are. And we can take those results, come back around to the pitches, look at every single pitch again, but this time adjust for those, net positive or net negative tendencies that certain players may display, and we'll run through every pitch again. That'll be our second iteration, and we'll get different results in that second iteration. It's slightly different, tendencies based on that, whether, a player is showing positive or negative. We'll use them again, flip around. With each iteration that we do, we'll see changes in the results that we get for each player, and with each iteration those changes get smaller and smaller until we converge on the true credit that each player that's involved in a pitch deserves for whether that pitch was called a ball or a strike. And typically this ends up taking about 10 iterations. And then, as you sort of heard in the history of analytics panel yesterday, this wouldn't be useful at all unless we could translate this into runs, which then can be translated into wins. So through our research, we found that converting a ball into a strike is worth about 0.12 runs. So those plus minus credits that we come up with at the end will then be converted into runs through this multiplier. So getting into the idea of this plus minus. Based on the four variables that Scott was describing to you earlier, the amount of credit that we actually are going to give on a pitch is going to depend on how likely that pitch was to be called a strike in the first place. And we know that likelihood based off of those four variables. So given the pitch location, the count, the command, and the batter handedness. So if you assume that a given pitch has a probability P of being called a strike, if that pitch is in fact called a strike, there's positive credit given plus, and that will be a positive 1 minus P credit, sort of 1 minus P extra strikes that were gained. And if that pitch ends up being called a ball, there's negative credit, and that's the sort of minus part of it, and that'll be sort of negative P credit, sort of negative P strikes lost on that pitch. And we'll run through an example just to make this a little bit more clear. So if you imagine a pitch that was 1 inch outside, off the outside edge of the plate, 10 inches off the ground, in a 2-1 count to a left-handed batter, this pitch would typically be called a strike about 43% of the time. So therefore, if the pitch is called a strike, there's 0.57 extra strikes that have been gained on that pitch. If it were to be called a ball, there would have been 0.43 strikes lost on that pitch. So let's imagine that this pitch is called a strike, and there's 0.57 overall positive credit to be allocated on this pitch. Now, let's say on that particular pitch, James Shields was the pitcher, Salvador Perez is the catcher, Arcia batting, with Dana DeMuth behind the plate. Apologies for the datedness of this example. I know that Shields is on the Padres now, but just sort of imagine these four parties being involved. So the first iteration, like I said, we don't know anything about the tendencies of any of these four people, so we're just going to divide the credit evenly among them. So that 0.57 becomes 0.1425 for each of the four. We do this for this pitch. We'll do the same thing for every single other pitch that they're involved in, and that'll be their credit. Now, At the end of that, once we've done that for every pitch, at the end of the first iteration, we'll add up all of those positive and negative credits and divide by the total number of pitches that each was involved in. And let's hypothetically say that at the end of that first iteration, on a per pitch basis, James Shields gets 0.018 strikes more than what would be expected on a per pitch basis. Perez, 0.002. Arcia plus 0.015, Dana DeMuth negative. He actually has a tendency towards maybe calling more balls than average. So that we can take these results and re-examine and make adjustments on each individual pitch that they're involved in. So if we look at that same pitch now, that pitch that had 0.57 overall plus minus credit to be allocated, what we have to do now is we're going to make adjustments given the individual tendencies of those players, and we're going to sort of separate that out from the portion of the pitch that can be attributed to a neutral environment. So given the 0.018 from Shields, the 0.002 from Perez, the 0.015 from Arcia, and the negative 0.005 from DeMuth, that combined plus minus per pitch from that first iteration comes out to about 0.03. So that's what's sort of attributable to the players themselves. We'll take that out from the 0.57, leaving 0.54, which is the part that's attributable to a neutral environment. That's the part that all four of the parties still have an equal claim to. So what we're doing here then, we sort of add the individual component to the portion of the neutral environment that each is responsible for, and you'll see we come up with different values that we're now assigning to each of these four players based off of that. So where, as before, the first time around, they each got an even 0.4125 for this pitch. Now, if you look at that far right column, Shields, because he has a higher tendency of getting strikes called, he's actually getting more credit. He's getting 0.153 on this, where somebody like DeMuth, who's actually working against the other three, he's still getting positive credit because the pitch was called a strike, but he's getting much less positive credit than the other three. And again, this is what we'll end up with for the second iteration. We'll, have once we add up all these pluses and minuses, we'll get different results. That 0.018 is going to change for Shields, and we'll just sort of keep looping around until those changes that we get from iteration to iteration get smaller and smaller and converge on a value that will ultimately represent his true impact on that pitch. Now, when we're involving, we're talking about something that involves four different parties, and there's going to be some concern, are we really independently dividing the credit amongst, each of these parties? So the big example of this would be, if you think about pitchers, they're often throwing to the same catcher over and over again. So how do we know that if there's a really good catcher behind the plate and a pitcher's coming out with positive numbers, how do we know that the catcher isn't just making his pitchers look good because he's good? So we ran some independence tests, and this was, we did this by running a couple versions of a with or without you test. So the first one was we looked at every pitcher and the strike zone plus minus that he was able to accumulate on a per pitch basis when pitching to a specific catcher. And then we compared that to his strike zone plus minus numbers on a per pitch basis that he accumulated when pitching to all other catchers cumulatively. We did that for every pitcher-catcher pairing that had at least 500 pitches thrown between the pitcher and that particular catcher, and between the pitcher and all other catchers over the 4 years worth of data that we were using at the time. And basically the point is that if a pitcher is no matter which catcher he's throwing to, you would expect his talent level, his performance level to be the same. And so therefore, we would expect a high correlation between those pitcher totals pitching to an individual catcher and all other catchers. And we found that we got an R value of 0.91, which is extremely high. So that made us very confident that we were independently separating the skills of the pitcher and the catcher. But to sort of drive the point home, we then looked at those same pairings, and this time looked at the catcher's accumulated numbers, both with that specific pitcher and then all those other catchers' accumulated numbers with that same pitcher. And again, in this instance, when we're keeping the pitcher constant, we would expect catchers' numbers to not be correlated with each other. And when we ran that correlation test, we got something very close to zero. So again, we're we're matching what we were expecting to see and doing a very good job of, I think, sort of separating the credit between all of the individual parties involved. And I know this is sort of quick and maybe potentially a little bit confusing. So there's an example here just to sort of display what I was just talking about. Eric Stultz, over the 2010 to 2013 window that we were talking about, when he was pitching to Nick Hundley on a per pitch basis, he was getting .02 strikes plus minus credit. When pitching to all other catchers, he got a very similar .019. When we look at Hundley, when his numbers catching Stultz on those pitches, he was actually negative. He was more likely to have balls being called while he was behind the plate there. But when we look at all other catchers, they're totally separate from what Hundley's numbers look like. They're actually showing a positive impact. So we feel really great about the independence and how well we're separating the credit for each of the parties with our methodology. So let's look at some of the results from 2014. One thing that we want to point out here is that relative to other methodologies that are out there, our numbers are going to show that the guys that show up as the leaders in those other systems are the same guys that are going to show up, and generally speaking, as leaders in ours. But because we're dividing the credit now, instead of the large credit that a lot of other methodologies seem to show catchers being worth, and something that I think that creates a lot of skepticism out in baseball in terms of catchers potentially being worth 30 to 40 runs in a given season, our results are actually showing that while catcher framing is certainly a significant value, we're only showing about 15 on average, 15 runs for the elite catchers in a given season. So something that's sort of much more moderate than a lot of those other systems out there. And that's, again, partly because we're taking some of that credit that's being apportioned entirely to the catcher in those other systems and reapportioning that to some of the other parties involved. With pitchers, you'll see that their totals are much smaller because they're involved in many fewer pitchers than catchers are over the course of a season, because starters are only going out there every fifth day. Relievers are only throwing 10 to 20 pitches in an outing. But on a per pitch basis, they can still be just as valuable as catchers are. When we look at hitters, one thing to note here is that positive numbers are actually bad for hitters. That means extra strikes are being called while they're at the plate. Negative numbers are good because fewer strikes than would be expected are being called while they're at the plate. And then I want to show you here something very interesting with the umpires. So umpires' numbers, their totals, come out much higher than both pitchers and hitters. Again, because they're involved in many more pitches than those parties are. But and here, what you should note is that positive numbers, these relate to pitcher-friendly umpires, because these are the guys that are calling more strikes than would be expected. The guys with the negative numbers, those are going to be the hitter-friendly umpires that are calling fewer strikes than would be expected. And you'll notice near the top of this list is Bill Miller's name. For the 5 years that we have data, he actually shows up at the top of the list, either in the 1 or 2 position every single year. And we put these numbers in place, during the 2014 season. And what was interesting was Bill Miller actually called the AL wildcard game. So when when this game basically came on, we were sort of interested to see how this would play out. And what was really interesting was to see that it did sort of validate the numbers that we were getting. So if we look at a few examples here of Bill Miller, this is a play in the second inning where pitch well down and outside of the strike zone that he ends up calling a strike, ringing up Giovanni Soto on. Another example from the fifth inning, this pitch ends up being closer to the edge of the plate, but again, Bill Miller, is where some umpires might have called that a ball. He's, definitely going to call that a strike. Another pitch from later in the fifth inning with Takoko Crisp, well down and out of the strike zone. He's, ringing him up there. And just to make sure, but the point is that this isn't all, it wasn't just because it's Shields on the mound. It wasn't just for the Royals. He was, and it wasn't just on pitches down in the zone. You'll see here an example where Lester throws a pitch well up and out of the zone. Eric Gordon walking away in disgust because of, the outcome of the pitch. So you can see that that the results are actually showing up in what we see in the game.
So you can see on an individual yearly basis and on some of those individual pitches, this has a very clear impact. But the natural follow-up would be exactly where does this fit in with the other measurements that we have with catcher defense? And I think this is best illustrated with an example with Yadier Molina and Jonathan Lucroy. So we all know that Molina is one of the best around, if not the best catcher in baseball. Since we created the Fielding Bible Awards back in 2006, he's won 6 of 9 of them. He's actually won 7 consecutive Gold Glove Awards. So we're potentially talking about an historically great defensive catcher. Lucroy more recently has been considered a good defensive catcher. He actually won the Fielding Bible Award for the first time last season. But before a few years ago, that wasn't the case. And some of the more obvious problems in his defensive game in terms of preventing base runner advancements, et cetera, it's prevented him from becoming accepted as one of the best defenders in baseball. But let's check this out across the board. So as you would expect, Molina is really good at pretty much every skill here. These are the components of defensive runs saved that we apply to catchers. So Molina is extremely good at handling pitching staffs. He's really good at preventing base runners from stealing bases. He's really good at defending bunts. He's also extremely good at defending pitches in the dirt and catching those and blocking those. He's even a really good framer. You see that 33-run save over the last 5 years makes him one of the best pitch framers, catchers in baseball. But check out Lucroy. Almost all of Lucroy's total value, is coming specifically from his framing ability. 85 runs that he saved over the last 5 years have been due to that, out of the total 92 that he saved. So basically what you're seeing with Lucroy, who again is the best framer by our methodology, his framing alone is bridging the gap between what would otherwise be an average defensive catcher and the best defensive catcher in baseball. So that's how important framing can be at those extremes. So this can have a variety of impacts, but the one that I think is going to make the biggest impact moving forward is with free agent catcher evaluation. There are a few reasons for that. One, as Joe mentioned previously, catchers are just involved in more pitches over the course of a season than pitchers and batters are. So even though there's similar consistency from pitch to pitch for all of those parties, catchers just have more impact because of the greater number of pitches. It's also important to keep in mind that we're already capturing a lot of the framing for batters and pitchers with traditional statistics like strikeout percentage and walk percentage. So it's important to know where those are coming from, maybe from a teaching perspective, but we're not greatly learning new things about how good batters and pitchers are overall because we're aware of where some of that's coming from. Teams don't have control over where the umpires are coming from. Maybe if I'm entering that wild card game as a pitcher, I'm going to throw a few balls just off the outside corner and see how it goes. But for the most part, teams just have to deal with the umpires that they're given. But the catcher is really where this can come into play. So we sort of think about it this way. Public research has suggested that recently the valuation of a win on the free agent market is about $7 million per year. As you saw before on the leaderboards, you're talking about 15 runs per season for the elite framing catchers, using an average of 10 runs per win. That's 1.5 extra wins per year for the best framing catchers. Just multiply the two together and you can recognize that we're talking about maybe $10 million of value that these catchers are providing that aren't typically captured on the free agent market. In fact, the only catchers that typically get paid $10 million a year are the ones that are the offensive stars of the game. Meanwhile, this is maybe more consistent a measurement from year to year and therefore more predictable than even offensive success. So this could have a really big impact down the line as this becomes an accepted thing. Let's see, I think we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions, if anyone has any. Vince. Yes. He's definitely one of the best framers from every year, pretty much. So that's very justifiable in our minds. Yeah. Yes.
Russell Martin.
When you did
Yep.
that reiteration the second time on your picture, could you explain how that happened?
Yeah, sure. So the first time around, we just divided the credit between each party individually. But so for that first pitch, Shields got a .1425. Now, that was just one pitch in the season that he's involved in. If we add up those positive and negatives that he was involved in for every single pitch that he was involved in over the course of the entire season, that number for him, let's say, adds up to something that's a net positive, right? So let's say it adds up to a plus minus of 100 extra strikes over the course of a given season. If we take 100 extra strikes and he threw 1,000 pitches, then we're talking about 0.1 like extra strikes on a per pitch basis. So it suggests that because he was a net positive over the course of all of his pitches, he has more of a tendency to get strikes called. And we'll do the same with all of, and so then when we look at the pitch, again, that individual pitch, we'll look at his tendencies, where he's showing a positive credit or a positive tendency. We'll look at the batters, the pitchers, the umpires as well. And now we're sort of dividing, like, I know this is sort of complicated, but it's basically looking at, because he had a tendency to get extra strikes called after that first iteration, he's going to be more responsible for the pitch being called a strike if his credit is, basically if his positive credit is more positive than the other 4 parties involved. Basically, like, whoever shows more of a tendency to get strikes called is going to end up with more of the credit on that given pitch in terms of that second iteration. What do you mean? No. I mean, there's no subjectivity involved in it at all. I mean, in terms of how much of an adjustment is made. It's, again, it was sort of, again, it gets complicated because we're separating individual tendencies from the neutral environment. If you want, I can sort of try to explain it a little bit more in detail off to the side afterwards. I mean, I think that's certainly one of the possibilities for this kind of information. Yeah, that you can, the teams can plan for the given umpire that's going to be behind the plate that day. Absolutely. Yeah, I think I saw you had your hand up first.
Have you guys started applying this data to like minor leagues? And if so, what minor league like catchers stand out?
We haven't actually. So our pitch charting data right now at BIS is just at the major league level. So we don't have the same data available at the minor league level. Yeah, and this guy.
Trying to walk the first base and he thought he got walk 4 call. When you looked at the umpires, did you consider the body language bias for a batter who thought he was getting a walk or a pitcher who thought he was getting third out?
Yeah, I think the most interesting question to me once you see the final results is how exactly are batters showing these consistent trends in terms of extra strikes and extra balls. And I think one of the ways may be some sort of umpire rapport. Now, maybe that's from body language, maybe that's from just talking to them, being friendly, developing those relationships. One of the interesting positive guys is Miguel Montero. He gets a lot fewer strikes called when he's batting and a lot more strikes called when he's receiving pitches. So I'm curious if maybe that would explain why some batters are showing those types of tendencies. Can I have a time check, or are we going too long? Good. We're good. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Come see us after if you have some more questions.